Jeremy, Humble Worm Farmer, a novel AI story. Art and visuals by DALL-E 2, Night Cafe, and CRA Ian. Narration by the text-to-speech robot. Soundscapes and voice acting by Icebane Gaming. Jeremy was a worm farmer. It wasn't the sort of thing you could be proud of, but he didn't know what else to call it. He had acres and acres of land in northern New Hampshire that he'd bought from an old man who was retiring after 50 years as a worm farmer, and Jeremy spent his days digging. One day, Jeremy found a very special worm. It was a rare type of earthworm, with a bright red band across its body. For the first time in his life, Jeremy thought about selling this particular worm for money. But he couldn't do it. It would ruin everything. This worm was special, and there were no other worms like him anywhere else on Earth. So instead, Jeremy took the worm home with him and put it into an aquarium tank in his living room. 7 days later, Jeremy heard something coming from the tank. The worm seemed to be talking to him. And when he spoke back, the worm did so with a perfect British accent.
"I'm sorry,"
said the worm.
"but I can't help myself."
The worm sounded desperate.
"What's wrong?"
asked Jeremy.
"Who are you? Where do you come from?"
The worm replied.
"My name is Mr. Worm, and I am from London, England. Please don't send me away."
Jeremy was shocked by all this. But then he remembered that some of his English friends had told him about people who could speak with animals. So he decided to take Mr. Worm to the local animal shelter to ask if they knew anything about him. There were lots of dogs and cats at the shelter, but none of them looked quite like Mr. Worm. After spending an hour or two there, Jeremy suddenly realized that he didn't want to give up on Mr. Worm. Jeremy looked upon Mr. Worm with a look of sorrow. Then he said,
"I guess you're not a pet dog or a cat."
Mr. Worm nodded sadly.
"Well, I've got some good news and bad news for you,"
said Jeremy.
"First, the good news. You're really smart. Your vocabulary is amazing. I bet your parents must be very proud of you. Second, the bad news is that I'm afraid I can't keep you here."
This made Mr. Worm sad.
"Why not?"
he asked.
"Because I'm a worm farmer,"
answered Jeremy.
"and worm farmers aren't supposed to have pets."
"Then what am I gonna do?"
begged Mr. Worm.
"Please don't send me away."
"I'll think about it.
said Jeremy.
In the meantime, you should get out of the fish tank and go to sleep."
Mr. Worm thanked Jeremy. Then he crawled out of the tank and curled himself up on the floor of Jeremy's living room. That night, Jeremy woke up to find Mr. Worm sitting beside him. Jeremy didn't want to wake Mr. Worm, but thought he looked cold. Jeremy covered him with a blanket. The next morning, Jeremy went to the store and bought some food for Mr. Worm. He also got some paper towels to clean the tank, since it was starting to smell a little funny. Mr. Worm ate a lot, and even started to grow bigger. After a few days, Mr. Worm was as big as a dinner plate. And although Jeremy still loved Mr. Worm, he wondered whether he should continue to keep him around. Jeremy looked into his wallet. He had saved $600 from his summer job, which he planned to use for college. If he gave Mr. Worm the money now, he could buy a nice house and live happily ever after. But then again, Jeremy thought about all the things he wanted to do before he left for college.
$600 isn't much to live off of,"
Mr. Worm said from behind Jeremy. This startled Jeremy as he didn't think anyone was in the same room as him.
"I know,"
said Jeremy.
"but I only have 3 months until my first year of college starts. I need to save up more money."
Mr. Worm sighed.
"I understand. What do you do, my little friend?"
"I'm gonna try to make some money,
Jeremy said.
but I just don't know how."
Mr. Worm smiled.
"My dear young sir, let me tell you the story of a great worm who lived long ago.
Go ahead.
said Jeremy.
Please tell me.
Once upon a time,
Began Mr. Worm.
a man named Sir Charles Lyell made his journey to the Himalayas. There he met a wise old hermit who was collecting medicinal plants and herbs. One day, while the hermit was gathering leaves, he found a rare plant and wonderful properties. He cut off a small piece of the plant and brought it back to his hut, where he used it to cure all manner of illnesses. Unfortunately,
Continued Mr. Worm.
the hermit didn't realize that he'd taken a large piece of the plant and left a lot behind. As a result, the plant grew wild in his garden. The next spring, the hermit returned to his garden with a group of monks. They discovered that their plants had been ruined because of the massive amounts of unneeded foliage. In fact, the entire forest was now overgrown with weeds.
Are you saying you'll kill the rest of my worm crop?
Asked Jeremy.
No,
Replied Mr. Worm.
I won't hurt any of your worms. But I can't help but notice you have an awful lot of them in this tank. And I hate to see you lose business, Jeremy. Because without my worms, you can't make any money.
Mr. Worm paused for a moment. Then he added,
Now that you mention it, I'd really like to stay here in New Hampshire and work with you. What do you say?
Jeremy smiled.
Well, I suppose I can't blame you for trying to help. But why don't you meet with my father tomorrow? I'll explain everything to him and see what he thinks.
The next day, Jeremy's dad came to visit his son. Jeremy showed him the worm farm. His father was amazed.
Look at all these worms.
Said Jeremy's father.
And it looks like you've already sold a couple pounds of them. Yeah,
Said Jeremy.
and I'm making a profit. Wow,
Said Jeremy's dad.
this is pretty exciting. Exciting?
Asked Jeremy.
You mean illegal?
His father frowned.
Oh no, I meant to say this is exciting. How many worms do you have?
Jeremy opened a drawer in his desk.
About 3,000.
He answered.
3,000?
Exclaimed his father.
I've never seen so many worms in one place. What are you planning to do with all of them? I'm gonna start a worm farm.
Said Jeremy. Jeremy's dad smiles warmly.
Now you're thinking like your old man. How do you get all these worms, by the way?
Jeremy explained about Mr. Worm and his special powers.
So far,
Said Jeremy.
I've earned $600 from selling my worms. How much do you want for the whole worm operation?
Asked his father.
$3,000.
Said Jeremy.
Are you kidding me?
Asked his father.
You can't be serious. Jeremy, you might be a smart kid, but you don't have a clue how expensive it is to run a whole worm farm.
Jeremy's father then pulls out a sheet of paper and crunches a bunch of numbers. He shows the paper to Jeremy.
Now this is how much you'll need for this business venture.
Jeremy's eyes grew wide at the sight of his father's figures.
$128,000 to be exact.
Said his father. Jeremy's father shook his head.
Trust me, Jeremy. You could open up your own worm farm in the Caribbean for less than this. But there's no way I could raise that kind of money. Not exactly.
Said his father, looking at the paper again. He lowers his paper and looks at Mr. Worm.
Mr. Worm, do you think you could help your fellow worm?
Jeremy's father continues to look at Mr. Worm, then looks back at Jeremy.
Well, you better figure something out fast. I hope you don't end up like me,
He frowns.
because if I hadn't blown through all my money, I wouldn't be in debt now. And believe me, that's no fun.
Jeremy's father turns to leave, then pauses.
Oh yeah, Jeremy, I almost forgot. Have you given any thought to what you want to study in college yet? No, Dad.
Answered Jeremy.
Well, I think you should study something practical, like carpentry.
Jeremy's father laughs.
What's so funny?
Asks Jeremy.
Nothing. I'm just saying, you'd probably be good at it.
Jeremy's dad leaves the room. Mr. Worm and Jeremy sit on a rug in front of the fireplace in silence. Suddenly, Jeremy realizes that Jeremy's father is right. He doesn't have the brains to be a college student. Jeremy knows that he'll never be able to pay off the $28,000 he owes for his education. As Jeremy sits in silence, he notices that Mr. Worm has stopped eating and is staring at him.
What's wrong, Mr. Worm?
Mr. Worm shakes his head.
Don't worry about it, Jeremy. I'm fine.
Jeremy then remembers something else.
Wait a minute. Do you remember that time you told me about the great worm who saved the world? Well, do you know anything about him?
Mr. Worm smiles and nods.
Yes, Jeremy. You could say we were very close.
So, where is he now?
Mr. Worm looks towards the window.
It's a long story. Let's go outside to talk.
The sun was high above the horizon. A gentle breeze blew gently across the land. Jeremy and Mr. Worm walked down the street. There weren't any cars on the road. It was obvious that everyone was away visiting family for the holiday weekend. Mr. Worm seemed bigger than Jeremy remembered. Mr. Worm started to talk as he wriggled beside his good friend Jeremy.
Long, long ago, there was a wonderful worm named Mr. Worm.
Jeremy nodded.
Yes?
He had a big heart and always helped people.
Continued Mr. Worm.
Really?
Asks Jeremy.
Who did he help?
Well,
Answered Mr. Worm.
he used to save the world from evil. He would fight crime and rescue those in danger. That's why I thought you might enjoy meeting him.
Mr. Worm stopped in front of Jeremy and stood up on the back of his worm body.
I'm Mr. Worm, Jeremy. I'm the magical being in all those stories. They are stories from my youth.
Jeremy was dumbfounded. He couldn't believe what he was hearing.
You're Mr. Worm?
Mr. Worm nods and replies.
That's right, Jeremy.
Jeremy rubbed his eyes and leaned backwards. He looked up at the sky.
You mean to tell me that there really is a giant worm?
Yes, Jeremy.
Mr. Worm wraps around Jeremy.
Yes, there is. And I'm glad you finally believe me. Now, you must promise me something.
Jeremy looked at Mr. Worm.
Of course, but what is it?
Promise me that you will never tell anyone about us.
Said Mr. Worm.
I'll never tell a soul.
Said Jeremy as he wrapped his arms around Mr. Worm.
I promise.
They both felt warm inside.
Now,
Said Mr. Worm.
it's time for me to tell you about my life.
Mr. Worm looked out at the beautiful sea. The water sparkled in the sunlight.
I was born near the mountains, Jeremy. I lived in the cave with my mother and father.
Jeremy noticed that Mr. Worm's voice sounded different as he spoke. It was deeper than normal.
My mother and father raised me as they did their own children. They taught me to crawl and swim. They even taught me how to hunt.
Hunting?
Asked Jeremy.
Yes,
Said Mr. Worm.
I used to kill animals for food. I liked it very much. It made me feel like part of the world.
That sounds nice.
Said Jeremy. Mr. Worm turned to Jeremy solemnly.
I might have enjoyed it a little too much. I love the thrill of the chase and the adrenaline rush of killing something.
He paused for a moment.
One day, I encountered another hunter. A human hunter who looked to me as if I were his next prey. He pointed a gun at me and pulled the trigger. It wasn't easy to kill a human, but I managed it.
Mr. Worm glanced over at Jeremy.
I was happy to have killed a human. After all, humans had been hunting me for a long time. Then one day, I heard a terrible scream. I went outside and saw two hunters standing over a pile of bones. It was one of my brothers and sisters.
Mr. Worm was in tears, but then he started choking out the next few words.
I knew I had to stop the hunters, Jeremy. So I set out to find a way to destroy them.
Mr. Worm looked at Jeremy.
I found it in the form of a beautiful woman. A human woman. She told me about her troubles with the hunters. She wanted me to help her destroy them. I agreed. We set out on a journey together. But then,
Continued Mr. Worm.
we ran into some trouble. The other humans couldn't accept the union over Worm and over, and the hunters became relentless. So, soon, our love was in jeopardy.
Mr. Worm was now in tears. He reached out and took hold of Jeremy's arm.
Help me, Jeremy. Save my love.
Jeremy was confused.
When did all of this take place, and how did you save the world?
Jeremy asked.
I'd love to help you, but I just want to know.
Mr. Worm laughed and wiped his tears away.
I'm sorry. I shouldn't have gotten emotional. Now, let me tell you about my adventures. We traveled the world together. We met many interesting people along the way. One man, for example, was half man, half beast. He made his living by stealing from others. The other was a snake who lived underground.
A worm?
Jeremy asked. Mr. Worm nodded and said,
Yes, that's right, Jeremy. I should have mentioned him earlier.
Mr. Worm continued.
And I also met a good person named Eddie. He was a mouse who traveled into a group of mice who were trying to save their home. They were being chased by a cat.
Cats aren't usually very friendly creatures.
Said Jeremy.
But what's the point? How did all these people and beasts help you save the world?
Mr. Worm smiled.
They taught me how to use my powers.
Powers?
Asked Jeremy.
Yes,
Said Mr. Worm.
I learned how to make myself stronger, faster, and smarter. And I use my power to protect all the people in the world.
What happened to your girlfriend?
Asked Jeremy.
She gave birth to a baby boy.
Jeremy thought for a second.
So, this is why you're helping me now?
Mr. Worm nodded.
Yes, this is why I've come to help you.
Mr. Worm began to speak again.
After years of traveling around the world, we finally came upon a village where I heard some disturbing news. The villagers claimed that the world was going to end soon. There was an evil force at work.
Mr. Worm put his hand on Jeremy's shoulder.
I knew I needed to do something. I used my powers to create a powerful weapon. Then I attacked the village and destroyed the evil force.
Mr. Worm looked over at Jeremy.
The villagers were so grateful. They offered me a job.
Jeremy scratched his head.
A job?
Yes,
Said Mr. Worm.
they needed someone to take care of the animals in the village. I accepted their offer. I promised to be there every day to feed the pigs, cows, dogs, cats, goats, sheep, and...
Worms?
Asked Jeremy excitedly. Mr. Worm smiled.
Yes, worms. I had to take care of all the worms in the village.
How'd you do that?
Asked Jeremy.
I created a special worm farm,
Said Mr. Worm.
a magical worm farm. I fed the worms to make sure that they all survived.
You're kidding.
Exclaimed Jeremy. Mr. Worm shook his head.
No, Jeremy, I'm not.
Jeremy put his hands on his face and sighed. Mr. Worm turned to Jeremy and said,
Then, after what felt like centuries, my farm was destroyed by a great and powerful evil. My world was in danger once again.
Mr. Worm took a deep breath and said,
I searched everywhere for another worm, but none could be found. No one knew where they went. I tried everything to find another worm, but nothing worked. Then I used my powers and grew.
Mr. Worm looked at Jeremy and smiled.
I now have the strength to protect the world. Jeremy, I need your help.
Jeremy was shocked. He couldn't believe what he had just heard.
What is a humble worm farmer such as me to do against a great evil?
I don't know,
Said Mr. Worm.
but I'll find out, and I hope you can help me.
Jeremy thought for a second.
You mean to tell me you're asking me to become a superhero?
Yes,
Said Mr. Worm.
I am, and I know how you could do it.
Jeremy pondered for a while. He looked up at the sky and stared at the beautiful sunset.
Okay,
He said.
I think I'm ready.
Mr. Worm smiled.
Good. Let's head back to my home. We have much to discuss.
Home?
Asked Jeremy.
Yes.
Said Mr. Worm.
You see, Jeremy, I have a lot more to tell you.
Mr. Worm led Jeremy back to his home. It was a small house with a sign on the front door. Welcome to the magical worm farm. Jeremy looks a little confused, but he puts his hand on his chest and takes in the sight of his new friend's home.
This is my home, Jeremy.
Said Mr. Worm.
The place where I lived my life. It's where I met my first wife and started my family. It's where I keep all my magical supplies.
Mr. Worm opened the door and showed Jeremy inside. It was a small living room, kitchen, and bedroom. In the kitchen, Mr. Worm had placed a large pot above a fire. He used it to cook Jeremy's dinner.
Is that a real stove?
Asked Jeremy.
Oh yes,
Said Mr. Worm.
it's a magical stove. Do you not have a kitchen at home?
Jeremy replies.
Well, yes. What about your stove is magical? Just this morning I was thinking about starting college and farming, but this is a lot to take in.
Mr. Worm laughs.
Don't worry about it. You won't be getting any better with time. That's for sure.
Jeremy smiled.
Your jokes are a bit inappropriate for someone your age.
What's that supposed to mean, young Jeremy?
Asked Mr. Worm. Jeremy looked down at his feet.
Well, I'm only 15. By most standards, I'm still considered young.
You're not so young, Jeremy.
Said Mr. Worm.
In fact, you're older than I am.
Jeremy looks puzzled and tries to do math with his fingers.
But I thought you were the Mr. Worm from all the stories.
Yes, I am.
Said Mr. Worm.
And I'm very old.
Old enough to be my grandfather?
Asks Jeremy. Mr. Worm smiles.
Not exactly. Have you ever heard of rebirth, Jeremy?
I guess.
Said Jeremy. Mr. Worm sits down next to Jeremy.
It means that sometimes we die and get reborn again. I was once a worm. I was born a worm. I died a worm, and yet I'm still a worm. A very powerful worm.
Jeremy sat up straight and said.
So what does all this have to do with me?
Mr. Worm reaches out and grabs Jeremy's arms.
There's a chance that you might be the next Mr. Worm.
Jeremy looks scared.
What do you mean?
Mr. Worm says.
I'm not sure. But maybe you have the destiny to become the greatest hero the world has ever known.
Jeremy shakes his head.
I'm not a superhero, Mr. Worm. I'm just a humble worm farmer.
Mr. Worm chuckles and says.
I know you're not a superhero, Jeremy. But what would you say if I told you that you could be the best worm in the world?
Jeremy thinks for a minute before answering.
I wouldn't know how to react. Thus concludes part 1 of the story of Jeremy the Worm Farmer. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you want to see a continuation of this story, as well as other AI-generated stories in the future. Thanks for watching. Have a good one.
Wiggle wiggle jiggle ma wuckin wumbo combo jiggle gilgle gilgle might pok jebber wire we org be wasiabriab slee ribs buo egr basful way pigments j kugel k jakings parel